and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today's show, we're talking about how many cars do Kiwis own and how many car parks should my investment property have? Now, this is such an important topic because if you're buying an investment property, you want to make sure that the property you buy has enough car parks for your tenants. Because if you don't have enough car parks, you might be worried, well, where are my tenants going to park? And am I going to be able to rent my property if the tenants I want have a lot of cars? The other thing, of course, is that car parks are expensive. They might cost an extra $50,000 if you're buying in an apartment and want to add on an extra car park. Same thing for a townhouse. And of course, some houses have space for one car, some for two, some have no car parks at all. So how many do we actually need if we are investing in property? Because we've got to think about rental returns, but we've also got to think about, will I be able to rent my property? Now, Andrew, let's start with some statistics. How many cars do Kiwis actually own as an average across the country?
So according to New Zealand's Transport Agency, there were over 3.4 million light passenger vehicles. So cars.
Yeah, cars.
Motorbikes?
No, not motorbikes.
Okay.
Motorbikes are separate. But things like cars, SUVs, all of those kinds of things. And just so you guys know, this includes work vehicles.
Right. Does it include like classic cars or something like that?
Yes.
Okay, so all the extra cars on top of just the ones we use every day. And there are around 1.9 million households in New Zealand. So that means approximately, on average, the average household has...
Approximately on average, the average household.
I knew as I was saying it. 1 3/4 cars per house.
So I've got 1 3/4 cars. You've got 1 3/4 cars. Everybody's got 1 3/4 cars. But let's talk about averages. Of course, none of us have 1 3/4 cars. You either have no cars, or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. And there's a little old joke in economics. Are you ready for it?
Oh, yeah, I'm ready for it.
Well, the average person has 1 ovary and 1 testicle.
That's actually better than I expected.
Well, and half a male something and half a female something. Now, we're all probably thinking, why is he talking about this? Because sometimes averages are not useful. So while the average person might have 1 of each, that won't be the case for the vast majority of us. And it's the same when it comes to cars. You can't have 1 3/4 cars. You either have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So Andrew, talk to us about the distribution of car ownership. How many New Zealanders have 0, 1, 2, 3 cars?
Okay, so from the 2018 census data, 7% of households report that they have 0 cars.
So that's about 100,000 people. And just to be really clear, this is how many cars they have access to. So we're not hiding people in here who say have a work vehicle but don't own it, but they can still drive it around. These are people who don't have access to any cars or choose not to. 100,000 people.
And then 34% have 1 vehicle, so that's about 500,000 people.
Yep.
Then 39% have 2 vehicles, and then it drops down to 13% have 3, 5% have 4, and 2% have 5.
So about 41% of people have access to either 0 or 1 car. These are households, of course. And about 60% of people have access to 2 or more cars. And so you might say, well, surely then on average, if 60% of people have 2 cars or more, I need to make sure that my property has enough car parks for 2 or more cars. That would be a natural assumption,
That would
right?
make sense, right?
But one thing you've got to remember as well is that homeowners are different from renters. So if you think about a property investor or somebody who owns their own home, usually you'll be a little bit wealthier, in some cases a lot wealthier than people who rent properties. And the reason is that you're able to build equity within this asset that you own, that house. And so it would be reasonable to expect that there would be a difference in the number of cars that a renter owns and the number of cars that a homeowner owns. Similarly, if you are a homeowner, maybe you're a little bit later on in life, you might be 45 and have 2 kids. Well, your household might need 2 cars so you can ferry the kids around to soccer practice or football practice, I should say, to netball and all of those different sorts of things. So your need for cars might be different. And so what I've looked at is the difference between renters and homeowners, and the differences are large. So, for instance, although only 3% of homeowners have no cars, 13%, an extra 10% of renters have no car. Same thing with one car only. So 42% of renters have one car, but 30% of homeowners have one car. And so what this says to us is 55% of renters, so over half of renters, have zero or one car. So only having one car park would suit perfectly 55%, the majority of renters. However, if it was a house for a homeowner, that same property, only having one car park, would only suit 33% or a third of homeowners. So we see a large difference between the number of cars or car ownership between people who rent and people who own their own homes. And I'll show you some more graphs for everybody watching on YouTube. I will describe it for people listening to the podcast, the audio version, but you will be able to find this on YouTube as well. So, Andrew, let me ask you this. What is the most popular number of cars that renters own?
It is absolutely one vehicle.
That's right. Way more people own one vehicle or have access to one vehicle compared to two vehicles. It's about 42% compared to 31%. But how does that change for homeowners?
Then it becomes two vehicles.
Yeah, so the most popular number of cars to own if you own your own home is two, about 44% compared to less than 30% for one vehicle. And so the important thing to note here is that there is a real difference in terms of the need for car parks between homeowners and renting out a property. So if I was flipping a property, so if I was buying a property, doing it up, and then selling it and trying to sell it to a homeowner, I would make sure my property had more car parks because the average homeowner has two cars. If I was doing a long-term rental, I would be less worried about car parks because the people I'm going to rent it to over the next 15, 20 years are likely to have not as many cars. That's a really important thing to understand. The average owner household has two cars. The average renter household has about 1.5 cars, bearing in mind those things I said about averages.
Now, Ed, take us into the data on regions because, of course, someone in Auckland might need, I don't know, more cars than someone in Hamilton, for example.
That is actually such a good point. I'm glad you asked that because what's important to realise is we all live differently in New Zealand. If we are based in Wellington City, for instance, where there are lots of apartments, good public transport, smaller city, more one-bedroom apartments, then there are going to be fewer people who need cars because they've got alternatives. They just walk everywhere. If I live somewhere like Ashburton, where maybe I'm a share milker and I work out on a farm and I live in town or something along those lines, the share milkers are all going to laugh at me because that's probably not what the setup is, then you probably need a car because you've got to drive around more. So if we look at the parts of New Zealand where people own the most cars, number one is Queenstown Lakes District.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, you've probably got higher income people.
Well, yeah, but I also thought that you might have, with the renters, people who are on lower incomes working in hospitality maybe couldn't afford to have a car.
Fair call, but I also wondered whether what might be pulling up the average is if you have a town car to drive around in, maybe a nice sedan, and then you've got a big SUV that you drive up the mountain in or something like that.
But you're talking about renters, right?
Renters and owners. Maybe you've got more bougie renters if people are in Queenstown for a couple of years, maybe not owning yet. There could be reasons for it, but the data from the official census tells us that Queenstown has the highest number of cars. Renters there, on average, have 2.05 cars. So more than 2 cars on average, owners about 2.17. But the important thing I'm looking at is only 35% of renters have 0 or 1 car. So if I was investing in the Queenstown market, having one or no car park probably wouldn't be enough for the average renter because lots of renters have more than 1 car. 65% of renters have more than 1 car. Interestingly enough, in second place, we've got Selwyn District. Now, that's where Rolleston is the largest town. It's about a 20-minute drive, maybe 15-minute drive from Christchurch, a place we often recommend. There, I mean, you tell me, Andrew, what sort of people live out in Rolleston?
Well, you're probably a family here. And so, you don't necessarily have to have a double garage, but you probably need to have the space to park a second car either the front of the house or in the driveway, because you're likely to have a tenant with 2 vehicles.
Yeah, it's a very suburban area. You've got lots of 3 and 4 bedroom houses. You've got a decent sized city now, actually, 40,000 people living there, but not much public transport. I mean, I haven't
Well, no,
caught
there's
a bus.
heaps of public transport, but I just think that, again, you're probably renting to a person who has a family, and like you said before, they're not using the public transport to drop little Timmy off to play soccer.
Yeah, well, maybe I need to catch a bus out to Rolleston and see what the public transport is like. But either way, only 37% of renters there have 0 or 1 car. The average homeowner there has 2.34 cars. So they are a car-loving people out in the Selwyn district. And places which you'd probably expect, places like Kaikoura, Southland, Central Otago, Otorohanga, all of these places that are a little bit more rural, those are the places where people have more cars and tenants have more cars. Not as much public transport. There is a need to drive around and possibly drive between towns because your town that you happen to live in is relatively small. Now, before I talk about Dunedin, Christchurch, Auckland, let's scroll down to the other places. Which areas, Andrew, have the fewest cars in terms of both renters and owner-occupiers, actually?
So Wellington's really interesting. So Wellington City, your average renter has basically 1 car. Your average owner has 1.6. So again, a lot of the people that are living in Wellington City who are owning their own house, again, probably every second house has 2 cars and then every other has 1.
And the main reason behind that is, again, good public transport, small city, probably not much parking as well. And so people are thinking, well, if I'm going to live there, I'm going to make a decision to have fewer cars. And you might think, oh, well, does that mean I need more cars? No, because people are voting with their feet, voting with their wallets and saying, well, I'm prepared to live in Wellington City, even if it means that I don't have as many cars. But the stat that amazed me is 74% of renters have 0 or 1 car. So having no car parks in a Wellington City apartment or having 1 would be perfectly adequate for most people, vast majority of renters in Wellington City. And interestingly enough, a place like Wanganui, actually 71% of renters have 0 or 1 car. Perhaps it's because it's a more lower income area, even though that particular city doesn't have that much public transport. The other one that really surprised me was Buller District. 68% of renters have 0 or 1 car. But let's look at perhaps our main cities. What about Dunedin, Andrew? How many cars do people have there?
So 1.3 on average if they're a renter, 1.8 if they're a homeowner. So 66% of renters have 1 or have less than 2 vehicles.
I wonder whether the student population is pulling that down. Maybe not that many students have cars there. So that could potentially say, well, if you're renting to students, you might not need many car parks. Maybe if you're renting to more of a family in a different part of Dunedin, you might need a higher level. We might be able to break down that data if we were looking at that specific area. In terms of Christchurch, they are bang on with the rest of the country average. So over half, 55% of renters have 0 or 1 car. What that probably suggests again is that if you're renting out a property, maybe you don't need 2 car parks. I know a lot of homeowners will say, oh, I want to make sure that there are 2 car parks because I've got 2 cars and that's what people need, right? People say that all the time.
All the time. People always think about their situation, and often if you've owned your own house for a number of years and you've got a lot of equity and you've built up your wealth, you probably do have the luxury of having 2 vehicles, but this doesn't make up the high proportion of the renters that you're going to rent your property to. They'd rather have a cheaper property.
And even if we look at Auckland, about 50% of renters have 0 or 1 car park. The average is slightly higher than Christchurch City, but still, if you have a property with 0 or 1 car park, it's going to suit, or at least 1 car park, it's going to suit at least 50% of renters who are in Auckland. And of course, it depends on which part of Auckland you're investing in and which sort of tenant you're trying to attract. But these numbers really surprised me because it showed just that massive difference between homeowners and renters. And again, a lot of people think I need to have lots of car parks because I don't want my tenants to park on the street. And if tenants have to park on the street, they're not going to want to rent my property. And what this shows is that is not necessarily the case. There are a large number of tenants where just a property with one car park would suit that perfectly fine. But again, Andrew, it probably depends on what you're investing in, right?
Yeah, I think you really need to take some serious consideration in who your tenant's going to be. So if you are buying in Rolleston or Rangiora or somewhere where there's larger plots of land and you're more likely to rent to a family, yep, probably at that stage you need to at least have the room for 2 vehicles. Doesn't have to be a double garage, but it has to have the room for a second car, because the likelihood is those people are going to have 2 or more vehicles. If you're buying a townhouse that's going to be rented to more like a young professional couple, 1 car park probably going to be sufficient.
Well, that's what the data seems to be suggesting. Now, what's your experience renting out properties with 0, 1, 2, 3 car parks available?
Well, I think if you're renting out a property with 0, then you have got a more limited market, but then again, price is the way that you actually attract someone for that property. So again, there's always going to be the price driver for a tenant's decision. And if your property is price competitive, yep, they've chosen not to have a vehicle because they're trying to save on money. And so probably there is going to be a market for that. But so long as you've got 1 car park, I think that meets the vast majority of tenants, as the data would suggest. So I haven't had any issue renting out those types of properties.
Yeah, I was reading an article of The Economist recently as well that was talking about how car ownership is declining among young people. Now, there are lots of different reasons why that might be the case, but there was another piece of research by Bloomberg which suggested that the reason is affordability. So rising cost of living, rising rents, rising cost of car ownership and petrol means that some young people are saying, you know what, I can't afford to buy a car, I'm just going to use public transport. And you might say, well, that's a really sad thing. Would it be nice if everybody could have a car? That would be nice, but the reality is that that especially among renters and increasingly among younger people, there is less of a need for places to put our cars because car ownership is declining. And the amazing thing is there aren't as many cars out there among renters as you might think. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you want to see this data and you're listening to the podcast, head over to our YouTube channel because I've been sharing the screen this whole time, walking you through the data. Just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew
We're
Nicol.
going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.